Thank you, Dr. Cologne. Next, we will have Dr. Kunkoski, and she is a health science policy analyst with the Food and Drug Administration and works in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. She oversees projects involving digital health technologies and electronic records and storage and clinical investigations. So Dr. Kunkoski, you can take it away. And I just want to do a quick reminder for anyone who has questions, please post them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we will get to those very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bettina. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you and I can see your slides.
Okay, great. Thank you. So as Bettina mentioned, my name is Beth Kunkoski. I work in the FDA in the Center for Drugs Office of Medical Policy. And today I'm going to provide a regulatory perspective on new technologies in clinical research. And next slide. This presentation is my personal opinion and it should not be construed as the FDA's views or policies. Next slide. So I will start with an introduction and then talk, most of my presentation will surround what we are calling digital health technologies and some of the regulatory considerations, as well as the verification and validation process. And then, as Dr. Cologne just mentioned, the development of novel endpoints utilizing digital health technologies is a big area of consideration when designing a clinical trial, as well as some other clinical trial considerations. Next slide. As we've heard all about today, that chronic diseases are a leading cause of disability and death, and the patient perspective is crucial to the development of treatments for this chronic disease. And the FDA has fully embraced this over the last few years through 21st Century Cures and the patient-focused drug development efforts. We need more methods to track symptom progression over time, and we need to encourage patient involvement and retention in studies regarding chronic diseases. Next slide. So digital health technologies are technologies that use computing platforms, connectivity, software, and/or sensors for healthcare or related uses. These may be passive measurements such as accelerometers, glucometers, ECGs, or they may require interaction from study participants to gather data through mobile phone apps or smartwatches. Next slide. And digital health technologies are the opportunity for remote data acquisition is remarkable. Time is of the essence. COVID-19 has fully accelerated our clinical trial frontier, and this is the time to embrace these technologies and improve the function of clinical trials. The possibilities of data collection are endless. It is possible to find the right drug at the right dose at the right time for a patient with these new therapeutic monitoring and management strategies. Next slide. So some benefits of digital health technologies are you can do dose ranging studies, and this would allow for characterizing the response over a dosing cycle. This is especially important with chronic diseases as these diseases progress and patient symptoms increase and their ability to get around and function decreases. We can monitor that remotely. There's the option for obtaining continuous or frequent measurements over time rather than that just your snapshot of your clinic visit. We can capture the response of patients in their real world settings. Are you doing things differently at home, work, rather than the artificial research environment? And all of this means potentially fewer in-person visits for subjects enrolled in clinical trials, which means less time taking off of work, traveling further to research centers, which will enable more participation and greater retention in clinical trials. Next slide. So what does it actually mean to use a digital health technology in a clinical trial? The regulations don't actually address the digital health technology itself. So that means it does not necessarily need to be approved or cleared by the FDA for marketing. If you are doing a therapeutic study to study a new drug for Parkinson's disease, the digital health technology does not need its own marketing application. It is included in that envelope of your IND study. And the focus of the digital health technology is to collect valid scientific evidence. Can this data technology provide adequate quality evidence for us to be able to draw conclusions about the safety and effectiveness of the therapeutic that you're studying in your clinical investigation. Next slide. One of the first steps when incorporating digital health technology into your clinical trial is the verification and validation process. And the purpose of this process is so we can have confidence in the validity of the data that is being collected throughout the duration of your study. So the first step is generally verification, which is done in a laboratory to show how accurate or precise the technology is in doing what it's supposed to do, such as the accelerometer measuring acceleration. How reliable is it in a variety of different settings? And then there's an algorithm that is almost always used to process this data. And so can we have confidence in the algorithm? Is it going to actually convert the accelerometer readings into accurate steps that a patient may take? After that, we would look at validation, and then you can assess, is the data recorded by the DHT the same as the data we would report if we were watching a patient take steps? Is this true in a healthy patient, a patient with a newly diagnosed chronic disease, or a patient that has had a chronic disease for a decade? How are these results affected by how a patient wears it? Is it different if you're wearing it on your wrist versus your hip versus your ankle? And then how is the DHT going to be accurate in a variety of settings, such as a car ride, riding a bike, all of these things that are part of our daily lives? We need to have confidence that the technology is going to understand and interpret those events appropriately. Next slide. So one example of this might be the 6-minute walk test. It was alluded to earlier this afternoon. It's a burden for patients to come in and conduct this test in a hospital setting. Maybe there's a way that we can put an accelerometer in a smartwatch and have a patient do this at home. I don't think we're there yet, but we are trying to, particularly in light of COVID, how can you remotely collect this data? So this is a great area where we think there's a possibility. Next slide. Formulating the endpoint. This is really what it's all about, is what does this data mean when you collect it, and how are we going to analyze it when your study is over? What is the clinical characteristic or event that is being measured? How are these measurements incorporated into the endpoint? Is it a single measurement, or is it a repeated measurement over a certain cycle throughout your study? There's often going to be a composite endpoint, patient-reported outcome plus actigraphy measurements. Next slide. The time frame. This one is really hard, particularly with something like steps. Do you look at steps in an hour, in a day, in a week, throughout a 3-month period, or do you do week intervals throughout your study to show how patients have progressed over time? That's one that really, it takes a lot of work to find out what makes sense depending on what your therapeutic area is and the intended mechanism of action of your drug or biologic. And then finally, how is this response reported over time for your study? Next slide. So some examples of endpoints incorporating data collected from digital technologies would include clinical laboratory measurements, continuous glucose monitoring, pulse oximetry, physiological measurements such as heart rate and rhythm, breathing, syncope, temperature, weight, and then the performance assays, where you might have an app that helps you conduct a series of physical tests that would assess stamina or strength, coordination, gait assessment. Sleep parameters is another really big area of can we monitor your sleep from home so that you don't have to go to a hospital setting where you're never going to get as good a night's sleep as you would at home. Next slide. So I also have a couple case examples to talk through, and as Dr. Cologne just talked about, atrial fibrillation is one area where that we see a lot of potential. A lot of smartwatches can now detect atrial fibrillation, and this has the potential to detect AFib in patients that would likely go otherwise undetected. in the way that these smartwatches are currently cleared is you are just flagged that your heart rhythm is unusual, and then you are supposed to follow up with your physician as appropriate. And then, of course, it is the physician's discretion to officially diagnose any atrial fibrillation or other abnormal heart rhythms, and then determine the best course of treatment. But if you're continuously monitoring this, you have the ability to understand if the pharmacologic options are truly being effective, and to determine the length of time that these treatments are being effective. Next slide. Another area where there is a lot of potential is osteoarthritis and a number of orthopedic conditions, rheumatoid arthritis. Again, it's the sensors with an accelerometer, gyroscope, GPS. You have the ability to track and see how much these patients are getting up and moving after you have your hip replacement surgery. Your surgeon wants you to get up right away, and now you can actually count how many steps you're doing after you have hip replacement surgery, and you can discuss that and share that with your physician, and they can say, no, that's not enough steps. Yeah, you need to double that tomorrow. You can measure the patient-reported outcomes. You can get full gait and motion analysis. And it's really the real-time feedback that I think is kind of the key that will engage patients of, oh, I can see every day I am taking more steps. I am making these improvements. I'm going to keep doing this so that I can get back to being fully mobile again. Next slide. So when you select a digital health technology for your clinical investigation, there's a lot that has to go into making the right selection for your disease area. The study population makes a huge difference. Many chronic diseases, they're elderly populations that are not necessarily going to be able to use the technology. And so you need to really think that through as you embark on a study that would incorporate a digital health technology. What is your study design? Are you going to be able to have a hybrid where you bring some patients into the clinic to collect this data in person while you're monitoring some others remotely to be able to see if you're really getting data that shows the effect of whatever therapeutic you're studying? There's the ability to monitor safety aspects of it. The support for the technology in the trial is going to be a heavy lift for sponsors to make sure that you're collecting all this data. You need to make sure that that data is actually making its way back to your databases so that you will be able to fully analyze that data. If your smartwatch isn't syncing, then you're not getting anything for that trial, and it won't be effective. And finally, the training aspect, which goes along with your patient population. If you don't properly train the study personnel, investigators, and patients up front, you're not going to be able to get the data to make your trial successful. Next slide. So COVID-19 has truly changed the way we will conduct all clinical trials moving forward. As Dr. Smith alluded to earlier, we have our conduct of clinical trials guidance document that we update very regularly. And I think a lot of these principles have been crucial for us to continue to do clinical research over the past year. And I think these principles will continue moving forward. DHTs allow us to collect many types of data remotely. It allows for broader participation and retention in clinical trials. It allows for more data collection. More data collection is not always better. The more data you are intending to collect probably means you're going to be missing more data than you do in your typical trial. So there needs to be a statistical plan in place on how to address that. But now is the time for innovative thinking. We're really excited about the potential for incorporating these technologies in clinical research moving forward. Thank you for your time.